All right. Thank you so much for joining us today for the Creating Safer Space Research Cafe. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Katja, and I'm the Academic Network Manager of the Creating Safer Space Network. And I'm here with Professor Berit Blissemann Guevara, who's the Principal Investigator of the network. The aim of this bi-monthly research cafe is to enable people in different parts of the world to exchange knowledge and help build a community of researchers and practitioners that work on unarmed civilian protection, or UCP. In today's Research Cafe, we will be sharing some top tips for publishing in academic journals, and we hope that this will help to increase the visibility of research on UCP. We will have an open discussion on this topic towards the end, but to begin with, we are very happy that Dr. Sukanya Podder has agreed to join us for this session and to introduce the topic. Sukanya is a reader in post-war reconstruction and peacebuilding at King's College London in the UK. And she has experience of publishing in a wide variety of academic journals, and she's also the deputy editor of the academic journal Civil Wars. So we are delighted that she has agreed to explain how the publishing process works and to share some top tips for publishing in academic journals. So thank you so much, Sukanya. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Katya, and everybody who's come along to listen to just a very candid and open conversation, I think, in terms of what are the potential challenges, or how best to prepare yourself. And I think for this kind of a network, which brings together researchers from different countries as well as practitioners into the fore, there are certain unique challenges in terms of publishing that I want to talk about. And I also come to this from the standpoint of being, leading on Global South submissions for Civil Wars. That was something, I'm particularly, believe strongly in, because often due to differences in academic training, in terms of writing styles, or the requirements in terms of referencing and, particular kinds of approaches that global North-based journals tend to emphasize, often we find that researchers from the Global South, or who are, who don't have English as their first language, tend to struggle particularly with publishing. So I think this is a really important area, where we are able to provide, if we are able to provide support, not only through the network, but also through my role at the journal, it's really important. Berit is also part of the editorial advisory board for Civil Wars, so she's well aware of this commitment that we have at Civil Wars in terms of supporting Global South submissions. So that's kind of, the overall intention in terms of the work that I do. Now, in terms of tips, I think we have to bear in mind what it is that we are trying to publish, right? So there are different kinds of pieces that we could try and publish. Obviously, there are shorter pieces. We have practice notes, certain types of journals accept practice notes, certain types of journals like Peace Review, which is a very interesting journal based in the US, where you can have even interviews with practitioners or with scholars, some sort of conversation that can be published. And then, of course, we have the more standard research article, which is anywhere between 8 to 12,000, sometimes even 15,000 words. Even within the category of research articles, there are different kinds of articles. One, there are journals which are focused on quantitative research and, tend to focus on databases and new types of quantitative data, which are mainly based in the US. But there are also journals which seek, more kind of review journals, which encourage us to contribute to debates within the discipline, whether it's international relations or peace and conflict studies or political sociology. So there are very distinct disciplinary kind of debates that one has to think about or situate one's research in before thinking about the publication process. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, once we have decided, as a team or as an individual, that our particular area of output, the written output, fits into a particular kind of journal, it's important to start kind of researching the journal itself. Even selecting the journal is a really important process, because if you're just starting with the publication process, be ready to be rejected, because even as senior scholars, rejection at different levels is part and parcel of the publication process, which means that it could be a desk reject, that the editors look at your piece and think it's not a fit for various reasons, whether it's quality, whether it's writing style, whether it's referencing style, whether it's overall argument might be too weak, or it just simply doesn't fit because the journal might have already published on this topic recently. So there are very many factors which can influence a rejection right at the initial step, which is a desk reject. The second step is if the editors like your journal and article and they think that it's a good fit, they might send it out for review. Now, these days, obviously reviewing is very much a voluntary process, and it's very difficult to get reviewers because of the workloads we have, at least in the United Kingdom. But overall, once an article has been sent out to review, usually two anonymous, peer reviews are sought, at least, sometimes it's three, and then you get the reviewer reports back. Now, that is like when you've already progressed into the chain, the publication chain. I just want to take a step back and think about a lot of researchers, particularly from the Global South, are overwhelmed and write to me, particularly at Civil Wars, asking for advice or seeking advice even before they submit. And I think sometimes that is helpful, but not always editors are able to help, because we also have to be careful about the amount of time that, and all of this is unremunerated time that we kind of provide in service to academia. But what is more helpful is, before you are ready to submit, is to have peers and colleagues and senior scholars, perhaps, if they have the time, to read your paper or to present your paper in various workshops or in more sort of conferences may or may not be useful depending on the panel that you end up in. But I have found closed group workshops to be very helpful in terms of honing arguments and finding more literature or being pointed to different literature. And of course, if someone can read your paper beforehand, whether it's a supervisor or a mentor or a friend or a peer, a colleague, it's really helpful in terms of developing your argument. That's the second kind of step. And then once you've decided on the journal, just reading some of the articles that have been published in the journal to understand what the style is, what the expectation is in terms of language and structure. And each journal will obviously provide you with guidelines on the submission process. Most of the submissions these days are online submissions. And some journals have now moved towards not having a strict referencing style like we used to. Like, you can do your own thing, and once it's been accepted, you then change it to the referencing style that is required. Or some journals are even going with, you can publish with your own preferred referencing style. It could be Harvard, Chicago, APS, or whatever. And then, of course, there are referencing software that many people use to help with this process. It's not so much, it's kind of preparing your paper for publication. All these steps are really important. But let's just say that, you have worked hard enough and, you have the paper at a level that you're confident, and you send it out to a journal. It enters the peer review process. I think there are also certain tips with how to revise and resubmit your article that I want to talk about. But at this stage, are there any questions, before I progress? Mm-hmm. No, people are happy?
May I?
Yeah, sure.
Yes. Well, thank you, Prof. Sukanya Podder, for the very practical tips. So, you see that there are many articles have different kind of standards. and we have to learn their writing style and argument and etc. How to write article based on their standards. So to do that mean we have to read and learn journal from that publication, right? So to learn how the style are accepted and the argument and etc. So we need to learn how to read a lot the article from that specific journal, and if so, that's mean maybe if so that's maybe it takes really like a lot of time with with this question that our publication may not be accepted, and when we move to other journal, then we have to read and learn again. So, how do you have any tips how to write like general style of writing style or etc. that might be accepted by many publications. So for sure there are some revision and other work have to do when they accepted our paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Arfian. I'm not sure if I've pronounced
Yeah,
your...
you spell correctly, yeah.
So that's a really good question. And it's again in terms of preparing to submit rather than once you've submitted a journal article. I think there is no written in stone guidance in terms of creating a foolproof journal article. Any creative output, it evolves over time. And these are very much dependent on, as I said, once you've written an article which is based on a literature review, on a strong argument, it's using some empirical data, and you have written up your findings. What is really helpful is to present these at various forums, whether they are workshops or whether within the university or at conferences, and secure certain feedback from peer academics, from colleagues. Once you have done that and you've made changes in response to the questions or weaknesses that have been picked up by those who read your paper, you have to look at various journals that potentially the paper could be submitted to. And you have to do a little bit of research in terms of, which journal seems to be most interested, let's say, in unarmed civilian protection in a particular part of the world. It could be an area studies journal. So if we are working on Africa, for example, it could be an Africa-focused journal, right? If you're working on Southeast Asia, it could be a Southeast Asia-focused journal, Latin America-focused journal. That could be one way of doing it. The other could be if you have a bigger kind of theoretical argument around the use of nonviolent approaches to protection, or a literature of all the different kinds of theories and concepts that have emerged, for example, with regard to UCP, then you could target something which is, a journal that has space for review articles or for articles which are more theoretical or conceptual. So that is a decision right at the beginning in terms of the kind of article that you want to write. Now, let's say the worst case scenario, you send it to a journal, and then sometimes, it's a blessing. It's a desk reject, right? Which means that the journal has let you know within 2 weeks that they don't think it's a fit in terms of, what you have written, your content and argument, and the journal's focus and aims and goals. In which case, you simply don't sit on the paper. You find you have a list of journals that you're going to target. So if the first one says, right, we don't have space for this is not quite a fit, you go for the second one on your list. And hopefully that's not a desk reject, let's say. And they send it out for review, but it's a reject because the reviewers have been unkind or have given you such feedback that it's such an enormous revision that often editors say that, the paper's too weak, even with revision, you can't really publish this paper. In which case you're in a problem in the sense that, then you think, what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to invest all this time to try and publish it again? Anybody who has published knows this very well, that rejection hurts. It hurts for a while, but then you forget about it. You put it in your desk drawer, bottom drawer for maybe a month or so. And then when you have time, you look at it with fresh eyes, or you get some feedback. And you look at the reviewers' reports. Often, and if you can detach yourself from the outcome of the rejection process and think of it not as a personal rejection, but as a reflection on a particular output, you can then often, at least in my experience, find quite valuable advice. Not always, but sometimes quite valuable advice in the reviewer reports. And I have, at least from experience, been selective about what kind of changes I would like to make at that stage before then again sending off to the third journal. And it has not been uncommon to have the paper rejected in the third journal, accepted in the third journal in that long list that you have of various journals. It is quite common. It is actually quite rare to be able to publish a paper in the journal of your choice. But it's not impossible. Again, it depends on the quality of the output. But it's a really long-winded answer, but all I'm trying to say is you have to be prepared that rejection is part of the process. You might need to revise your article several times, and you have to be able to commit that time to being able to publish.
Can I do one more question? Sorry. Yeah. Do you think that we can submit our paper to some journal at once, or we have to do one by one, reject it and submit to the other and stuff? Well, just to make efficiency of time.
Yeah, no, I think it's really important to submit the article at one journal at one time, because journals don't allow you to have multiple submissions of the same paper, because what might happen is it goes to the same reviewers, and it can be a really problematic issue. And normally it's not allowed. Like the journal will ask you to kind of tick a box when you do the submission online as to whether it's under consideration with any other journal. So that's like standard practice. Barry, did you have a question? I think
I was gonna make a comment on this as well. I think one thing a colleague once said to one of our PhD students, in which I found a really good piece of advice, is, so as you look around for other literature that your article will speak to, have a look what these other people that you're interested in, where these other people have published their work. So these might be really interesting journals, rather than looking somewhere else. So where are the people that you read and where do they publish in? I think is a good piece of advice. And I think some of the journals, once you look at them, you will already see they are not a good fit, because, for example, some journals specialize in quantitative studies and your article might be a qualitative one, so where you don't have any numbers in them. So don't just send it to the quantitative one, they will not publish it. So I think there's a lot we can already rule out. And then of the ones that are there, of course, there are certain things that are in every article, like an introduction and a conclusion, and it has to somehow have a question and the theme and so on. And then other things might need to be slightly adjusted as we go through that list that Sukanya mentions. Sometimes journals have more of a, as she said, more of a theoretical focus. Others have more of a practical focus. So sometimes there's things we need to adjust as we go to other journals, but it's not like a rewriting of the whole thing, because there are some standard elements that are in every article. And I think a really good piece of advice is trying to send it to somebody to read it before you submit it. So what we will do, especially for people who have not that much experience in our network, is we will offer you to do that and to send it to us and have a look at your article before you submit it as well.
Yeah. I think we have a question from Beatrice, if I pronounce your name correctly.
Hola, Bea, no se te escucha.
Tengo problemas con el video, ¿me escuchan?
Ahora sí.
Bueno, no
el video
logro
no.
poner la cámara.
I'm just having issues with my video. My camera wasn't working. Okay, it's working now. My question is, because you were mentioning some previous processes in terms of submitting ideas, that you could go to events, but I'd like to have a conversation regarding the limits that the journals can have, and in terms of merits. To what extent a document in the process or of public events can be unedited? I don't know what limits do journals have in regards to that?
I'll wait for translation. Is it Christian who's going to translate for me?
Yes, but do you have the English activated?
On the interpretation button, you have to choose the English.
Oh, I haven't actually. I'm really sorry.
So we go on interpretation and then on English.
Right.
Have you done it?
Yeah, I have done.
Beatriz, ¿tú puedes repetir lo que has preguntado, por favor? Porque no estaba
Ok.
el botón de
Sí, mi
interpretación.
pregunta es que
My
cuando
question is, when you talk about a way of surveying whether the article is good or not, to go to different events, to submit it to different reviews by different people, and so that people give you feedback for the article. My question is, taking into account journals usually ask for articles that are submitted or unedited and that they haven't been exposed publicly, that they haven't circulated publicly. What's the limit that we have in terms of that? Because many journals can say, well, if this was in a public event, this is not an unedited article anymore. What's your experience with that?
Yeah, thanks so much, Beatrice. From my experience, I think it's always what we call work in progress drafts, right? Or working papers. So you are free to present your work in progress or working drafts of your paper at events, including at conferences, at workshops. For PhD students, they often have doctoral student forums. And it is not there is no kind of notice will prevent you from discussing your ideas. Of course, I have heard and I have also experienced sometimes that when we freely discuss our ideas, these often turn up in some other person's journal article. So that is one of the negative sides of academia, because we can't really control thoughts and ideas from being stolen. And that's a kind of different kind of plagiarism. But what has happened recently is often I find that as soon as a working draft of a paper is available and you're about to present it at various forums, whether it's conferences or workshops, researchers have started to upload a version of their paper, which is a working draft with a date, with their name, and title of the paper and a draft of the paper onto websites like academia.edu or ResearchGate, or there are even other websites. I'm forgetting the name, this SSRN, Social Science Research Network. And what this is doing is it's actually helping you hold on to the originality of your ideas. So if somebody is sitting in a workshop listening to your ideas and does not acknowledge when they are writing their paper that they actually initially heard about this concept or a particular finding in your presentation, you can always challenge that because you have ownership by using a working draft or uploading a working draft onto a website. And journals will not prevent you from doing this because these are all drafts. Even when a particular draft has been submitted for review to a journal and it goes out for review, by the time it will be published, it will look like a different paper in most cases because you get so much feedback from the reviewers and you make revisions in response to the feedback. So I would say that feel free to, share in confidence, your paper. Sometimes we even put a caveat that, not to be distributed, or ask the author before you distribute the paper or before you quote the paper or cite the paper. But a good way to kind of prevent plagiarism is to upload working drafts of your paper onto various networks like the Social Science Research Network, academia.edu, and ResearchGate.
Thank you so much.
If we don't have any further questions on the initial part of the process, I'd be happy to, keeping an eye on the time, to talk about revise and resubmit. And because I think that's also an important part of the hurdle to publishing. I think the first thing one has to start with is the premise that a revise and resubmit is actually a positive outcome. In most cases, if you've been given a chance to revise your paper, the editors feel that there is value in revising and it is very likely going to be published. But there's no need to be complacent, because I've also had experiences once you have revised the paper in response to reviewer reports, depending on how well or not well you're able to address and make the changes, usually the paper will go back to the same reviewers so that they can, make a decision as to whether the changes are appropriate or to a standard where the paper can be published. And oftentimes in the second round of reviews, you may not make it. And I have had 2 experiences where the paper had an R&R, had a revise and resubmit. For whatever reason, the revisions that I made did not result in a publication. So the paper was rejected at that point after revision and after like 2 years or a year and a half at least in the publication process. One of these was a very highly ranked journal. The other was a normal journal, but it really didn't matter in terms of the ranking. This was the outcome that I've had twice in my own career. So while revise and resubmit is a positive outcome, I think it is one has to do the best possible revision in line with or in keeping with the requirements or the points that have been raised by the reviewers, because oftentimes, in our busy lives, we may not be able to address all the changes sufficiently. For whatever reason, the changes are not up to standard, which means that the expected standard, which means that it can be rejected at that stage. The second thing I think which is really important is often if you have 2 or 3 reviewers writing reports on a particular journal article, sometimes they can actually give you very conflicting advice. And it's quite a dilemma as to, which points of revision you pick and choose. Sometimes I found that the editors can be quite helpful and will actually write a few paragraphs about what they think are the most important issues that need to be addressed in the revision. And this is rare, but it's becoming increasingly rare. But at least in my now aging career, I have seen some editors take time to actually write a few paragraphs as to what they expect the revisions to look like, which is incredibly helpful. But if that is not the case, if you have conflicting reviews, again, I think it's important to perhaps seek guidance from the editors. I would definitely, write to the editors and say, the reviewers is asking me to do different things. What do you think are the most important areas, so that I can produce the most, best fit paper for the journal? Then the second thing is kind of, again, detaching the damage to our egos, which happens when you look at very negative reviews, and actually looking at it from the standpoint of the reviewer as to why the reasons are being raised, why they are evaluating a certain part of your findings or part of your theory negatively, and then kind of just making a very objective judgment as to what are the most important ways in which you could address these questions. And sometimes actually even editing or eliminating certain parts of your argument, so that you might be presenting an argument that contradicts perhaps some elements of your theory or some elements of your findings. I think having a very detached, objective perspective about the review reports is really important. And being very systematic, making a list in terms of, I've usually found that there are the big changes that need to be made and the small changes that need to be made. The small changes are easy to do because they're about references or, paraphrasing or font or, sometimes even grammar, syntax and things like that. So it's relatively easy. And then there are the big chunk changes, which you need to again break down into smaller changes so that these are bite-sized improvements to your paper, rather than thinking of this paper as this huge entity that you live and die for. Thinking about, okay, within the theory, what are the elements that I need to change? Within the findings, what are the elements that what do I need to add to the literature review? So, once you do this over and over again, it becomes simpler and it's not as daunting. But the first time around, seek out advice from the editors, from peers, but too much advice can also be like too many cooks trying to make a broth or something. So sometimes you also have to be firm and rely on your own judgment in terms of what is the best route forward. And as much as possible, follow, if a journal has given you R&R, follow the style of the journal, read some of the recently published articles, cite some of the recently published articles if these are, somewhat linked to your own research, because it shows that you are engaged with their scholarship and it shows that, you're contributing to the debate within the journal. So a journal might be, interested in a particular kind of debate, for example, everyday peace, like peace building journal that is run by one of our good friends, Roger McGinty. It has a lot of focus on these microdynamics of peace, on people-centered peace, on everyday peace. So if your article talks about, community agency or the agency of groups and individuals and how this has contributed to peace building, you might want to engage with some of the debates around the microdynamics of peace building within such a journal. Then there's the journal called Intervention and State Building, again, which, Berit and I are both involved on the editorial board, where the focus is much more around, looking and with a critical lens to issues of liberal peace building models and how, the bottom up and the top down and, these interactions. So keeping in mind the journal and the overall kind of tenor and focus of a journal when you're revising is quite important. And the final thing is take your time, because a journal usually gives you a certain amount of time. These days, it's usually 3 months. But if you need a bit more time, take it, but don't leave it for 6 months, because I have seen if you leave a revision for 6 months, invariably you will forget what you have done. So it is also being, striking the balance between not rushing with revisions, but also not leaving it to the last minute. So have a plan in terms of the proposed time scale and within which you want to make your changes. The other thing is, some journals are now going through 2 rounds of revisions, and this is not uncommon. So you do your revisions, it goes back to the reviewers, and they might ask you to do more revisions. So you have to be mentally prepared that there might be another, round of revisions, and that might require more time and even more effort. The other thing is that while these are time-sensitive issues, I think it's also important to contextualize some of our work in terms of the events that are going on in the current world. Like often I've seen introductions start about, event in the current world. At the moment, of course, it's in the Middle East, but even Ukraine. And trying to relate your findings to real life events tends to grab the attention of both the reviewer, the editor, and also the readership. How do you apply certain things? When it comes to unarmed civilian protection, these debates can potentially be applied to some of these ongoing conflicts. And I know Nonviolent Peace Force is now quite active in Ukraine, where it would know more. So kind of thinking that, maybe your findings are from Latin America, but how do these then apply to real world events like, in Ukraine or in Middle East? And finally, I think for academics like us, we learn so much through these revise and resubmit processes, that at least for me in my academic career so far, as I add more gray hair, I have actually learned a lot, and I have become less, I feel less knocked back by rejection these days. I take it in a positive stride, much more than when I started my career. I don't feel as deflated by rejection as I used to, at least in academia. And the other thing is I always take them to be learning opportunities, because we can learn a lot from the publication process, and particularly for those who are beginning their publication journey. I cannot, repeat this enough. Be ready for rejection and don't take it personally, including with revise and resubmit. As I said, I've had two, at that time they were traumatic because of the amount of time that went into revising the papers, and then they finally got rejected. But just take it as a learning curve. Sometimes you may or may not be able to publish in the journal of your choice. If you do, great. If not, it might be a better fit in a different journal. And also start perhaps with journals which really are interested in your topic. Do that research. That's the most important thing, because that makes it much more easier for you to publish if you are targeting a journal, because some journals are always looking for papers and actually don't get enough papers. And these journals are usually easier to publish in compared to the top journals, which have far too much demand and are more likely to reject your paper. Berit.
To say that you're a much better person than me, because I get angry every time I get a rejection or a really nasty review. And then what I do is I have a rant about it. I say, oh, these people don't understand me. Then I put it to one side for at least a week and then return to it, because then I'm much more able to actually deal with the content of what they said and not just with my anger. So yeah, I do have my anger issues still, but there we are. My disappointment with it.
I don't know. I think the more, and also I am not as, running to publish like many papers these days, because there's just too much teaching, admin, supervision, and other duties, which means that I tend to publish more selectively. And these papers usually take a long time and many journals. So I've gotten a bit kind of used to that pace, that a paper will take its own sweet time before it gets published. And actually, from my experience, I find if I don't rush, to have it published like within 12 months, usually the paper evolves into something better. I don't know why, or maybe it's just how I work, that when I work over time on a particular idea, it actually turns out to be much more enjoyable when I read it and like the final product.
Brilliant.
Maybe I'm soft. That is the problem, Berit. I'm too soft.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sukanya. That was really, really helpful. Now we have some time for any questions, but also if anyone has any of their own experiences to share, we would love to hear them. Or if you got any top tips of your own to share, that would also be really helpful. So either questions or any experiences to share. Would anyone like to start?
Can I ask Louise to share something? Because she's starting off, in this postdoctoral phase of her life, and she's already publishing. Maybe she has some tips as well.
So I put my hand up with a question. I don't think I'm the right person to be advising anyone at the moment. I guess the one thing that I would say that I have found really helpful is what you were saying of having people and friends and people that you trust really well reading your work. I always have people read a few times before my work gets anywhere, and I think that's really helpful. And sometimes it's easier said than done, but I think finding that community also can give you the confidence a bit more to be willing to share your work. The question I had was around kind of selecting journals, and there's a lot of kind of talk and pressure, I think, for ECRs and people not in permanent jobs. We often get this advice that you need to publish in like a 4-star journal or something with really high impact. And I wondered what you thought about that, and like how accurate is that advice? How feasible is that? How do you go about finding these kinds of journals, or is that also not good advice? I don't know.
I'm not sure I have published in a 4-star journal myself, but I have published in lots of journals. And one of the positives I have is people have read my work and cited my work. So over the years, that is the main thing which has given me confidence, Louise, that, people read my work and people cite my work. At the same time, the journals that we must target, they have to be international journals. They have to have a certain amount of standing in terms of, what is it called, Perry? The index. That they're included in the citation indexes and things like that. So that's one thing. The second thing is I really think it's important to think about what your intention is for a paper. Do you want to add new theory to a particular debate? Do you want to add new concepts? Do you want to do typology? Do you want to publish more practical stuff, empirical stuff? And that is the thing, deciding on your output and the fit with the journal. It is possible that the journal could be a really top-ranking journal, but often I find that unless your initial output is speaking to some of the debates in a particular journal, it's very hard to work it the other way around. Perhaps you could then, one of the ways could be, and I have seen some colleagues do this, is that they target a journal, they read about the the papers in the journal, they have a very good idea as to what kind of literature is being published, and then they go about designing a project, particularly quantitative projects. They go about designing a quantitative project which would then be a very good fit with the journal. So it's actually the other way around, that you have a journal in mind, you read the stuff being published in a journal, and then you plan and write and everything around that journal. So that's like that's what you're targeting. But in my case, perhaps because I am lazy, I think I always go for interesting ideas and projects and things that are of interest to me as an academic, that make me wake up and feel passionate and interested. And then the outputs that come out, I kind of would like to see them in particular journals. And oftentimes, I have not been able to publish in my top choice, but invariably they've ended up in journals where they've been well read. So I think they were a good fit. So there's no straightforward answer, Louise. You could be very instrumental about it and say, right, I'm going to go for APSR and read all the papers in APSR and develop a project and write a paper for APSR and say, right, this is what I've done. But it really depends on the amount of work, the amount of motivation you have. That is not how I have gone about my career. So I'm probably not the best person to talk about it.
No, thank you. It's nice to hear different perspectives on these things.
Berit.
Yeah, I think I'm exactly on the same page with you, Sukanya, because I think there are lots of super duper papers in high ranking journals which have never been published because people get caught up in the idea that it has to be a certain journal. What we actually want is get our work out there in a decent publication with people who will be interested in reading it, and if we're academics in citing it, if we are practitioners in using some of the insights, right? So I think that's the most important thing, really. Everything else is just...
And also rankings change. For example, a journal that was very new and I had published several years back, the ranking has gone up incredibly. So you might think I'm lucky. But that's the thing. I have had a more relaxed attitude to publication. I've not made it. I know some people get so caught up that they don't publish, because it's either APSR or nothing. And I can't believe that, that's the attitude. I'm just interested in the topic. I want it published. I want people to read it. And maybe that's just a different way to approach academia, Louise. I think you have to take the call as to which side of the, divide, if we can call it a divide, you want to be. Okay?
Any other questions or anyone that has any experiences to share?
I have a question,
Adriancia.
but I'll follow after the other question.
Well, thank you, Prof. Sukanya. So, I would like to know, based on your personal experience as one of a reviewer, so what kind of paper that you rejected and accepted? So what's the
I think first thing is, if it's not a fit with the journal. So if a journal is focused on peace studies, right, and an article is mostly looking at IR theory or looking at critical security theories, it is very unlikely that the paper will be accepted into the journal. Like, the editors are very likely going to reject. So if you're talking only about peace building or protection or civilian agency, and you want to publish in a very IR focused journal, right, like international relations, without any IR theory, it will not be a fit. So that's an obvious kind of issue of that the paper simply doesn't speak to the journal. In other cases, I think some papers, at least from my experience of looking at Global South submissions, they really need a lot of work. As in, the literature review is often not as well written, or the citations are not in place. Often there are far too many quotations, or the presentation style and structure. So there could be problems with the way that a paper has written as well. Sometimes the findings, although the scholar is saying that they have undertaken 100 interviews, you don't have sight of a single interview data. So you're like looking at the methodology and it doesn't quite reflect in the findings. So there can be certain structural issues with the way a paper has been written. These are the two main kind of problems that I have seen with papers being rejected quite early in the cycle. I had a question for Berit, actually, because Berit manages so much. I don't know how she does it, but she's just tremendous. But Berit, you have worked with practitioners. You worked with scholars, in different languages. What are some of your tips with regard to publishing with practitioners? Because I've published with a couple of practitioners, but they are also people I've worked with for so long that it's a different relationship. But with building new trust building relationships, which are not always easy, I just want to have your reflections on this process, particularly when you're publishing, because invariably when we are co-authors, somebody is doing more than the other. And you have to kind of accept that as part and parcel of co-authoring. I just wanted your tips on that.
Yeah, that's true. So recently, on recent years, I've co-written quite a few pieces. So with early career researchers being the more senior person, or with people who are more practitioners of the work they are doing, people in different languages. And I think what has worked was to kind of, so I think working or writing together with people makes contributions stronger. So I really believe that. I think it's really good. And the way that it has worked well was when there was a first meeting between the people who were writing together to set out, okay, what is it that we actually want to write about? What is our idea? What is our core argument? And then have a structure that everybody agrees on. This is how we're going to write it. And then distribute tasks. Now, my task would usually be, so somebody in this group will have to have the task of writing whatever everybody else is writing in one language. And I mean, sometimes I mean really in one language. So sometimes I work with people who write in Spanish and then I translate it to English and I write the English article, or vice versa. When we write in Spanish, then I will not be the person who puts it into the final language, but also to speak with one voice, let's say. We all have different styles and so on. So I'm quite good at pulling things together and making them look like we've actually speaking with one voice. I would say that's one of my strengths. Other people are much better with literature reviews. Laura, who's here on the call, for example, is amazing when it comes to literature reviews. Other people are better with just describing the empirical work that has been done and so on. So I think it's also about finding the strengths of people. So yes, somebody at the end will have to pull it all together and write it in one voice, but it doesn't mean the others haven't got an impact into it, an input into it. So I think it's finding the strengths of each author and then distributing the tasks so that in the end everybody's happy with the output and it has a chance to be published. So that's quite important. And if somebody is particularly good with, I don't know, doing the references, then that's their task, because that's a really tedious task and I don't like doing it. But if there's somebody who can do it, then I'm very happy to let them do it. So I think that's the kind of thing, right? Everybody has their strengths of what they know and what they can contribute. And sometimes my strength is not necessarily the content as such, but pulling it together. And others have other strengths. I think that's what has worked for me.
Thanks, Berit. But it all takes a lot of work and time.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely the case. It takes a lot of work and time, but I think it's worth it. And as you say, if we don't overburden ourselves with too many things, then it's worth kind of putting that work in, because the result will be so much better, more satisfying for it. And it's nicer to work with other people, I find. Also, when you get those reviews or rejections, you can kind of talk to the others, say, oh, they were so nasty, and now let's move on and kind of work through it and submit it somewhere else or revise it. So working with other people on it is actually also nicer when it comes to the not so nice parts of publishing.
Thanks so much, Berit. I really enjoyed this, actually, although we are not, one of the things is of such a diverse network, people being in different parts of the world, that we rarely meet, but still this online interaction is also quite energizing.
I think we'll have time for one final question or suggestion or top tip of, or whatever you have to share. Berit.
Yeah, maybe just to say, if you are here and you promised your project promised to write an academic article as an output, no panic. We are not expecting you by the end of the project to have published that article, because we know everything that Sukanya has talked about, how long it takes and so on. If you have a draft of an article that we can then read and then decide together where you want to send it and so on, that would be great. So there's no way you can, within the project length we have, you can publish these articles, because that's just not going to happen. But it's also out of your control. What you can do is draft something that we can work with, and that's more than enough to tick the box, so to speak. So it means that some of the work will happen after the project, but that's the nature of an academic article. But then hopefully once it's drafted, the main work is done, and then the rest is more these revisions and this work to really make it fit.
Brilliant. We will be in touch, at least with those people from our Creating Safer Space projects that we know are publishing articles, and we might also put on some future events on publishing, and these will be advertised in the newsletter along with our other future Creating Safer Space cafes. So I'll pop that in the messengers. So if you haven't subscribed to our newsletter, then please do so, and we'll be able to inform you about future events. A big thank you to everyone for participating in today's Research Cafe, and especially to Sukanya for introducing the topic and for sharing your insights. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.